I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, but most importantly, I'm a father, and there are 3 types of medications I would be extremely cautious about ever putting my kids on. Now, this isn't because kids don't suffer or because parents don't deserve the help, but it's because once you understand what these drugs actually do to the developing brain, you can't unsee it. And so what concerns me the most right now is that parents are rarely told the full story about these medications. And so today, I want to walk you through 3 common medication classes, why they're prescribed, and what the data actually shows, and what I would do before ever agreeing to them for a child. But first, why should you listen to me? Well, it's because I've worked in the system for a long time. I've been a board-certified psychiatrist for over 10 years, and I've worked in the pharmaceutical industry and at the FDA researching psychiatric medications. And for the last decade, I've specialized in helping people come off psychiatric medications, often after they've been harmed by them. And so this isn't theory for me. This is what I've been doing for a long time and what I see every day. So with that said, let's jump into it and start with the most common medication first. And so the first medication I would be worried about are antidepressants. These are drugs like Prozac, Zoloft, and Lexapro. And most kids who end up on antidepressants are given them for anxiety or depression, sometimes after a single short doctor's visit. Right now, about 1 in 20 American children are taking these. And parents at the visit, they're usually told things like, this will help rebalance their brain's chemistry, or it's better to treat early than to risk things getting worse. But here are the things that rarely get explained about these antidepressants. The first thing is that these drugs increase suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So when antidepressants were first approved in the clinical trials, they were approved because they slightly lowered depression symptoms scored on a scale compared to patients who were given placebo. But after approval, something very disturbing happened. Parents started reporting that their kids, who had never been suicidal before, suddenly became suicidal after starting the medication. And when the FDA looked at this and they looked at all of the clinical trial data for antidepressants, they found something shocking. Children and adolescents and even young adults up to age 25 had higher rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviors than those who were given the placebo medication. I want to underscore that again. You were more likely to engage in a suicide attempt if you were given the antidepressant in the clinical trial than the fake sugar pill placebo. And so what does this mean? Well, it means on average, these drugs increase suicide risk in kids. And many parents are never told this. And just think about this. Imagine asking for help with the most precious thing in the world, the mental health of your kid, and being given a drug that statistically increases the risk your child may try to take their own life. This is hardly a better safe than sorry intervention, as it's often pushed and sold to parents as. This is actually the opposite of that. Now, the second issue with the antidepressants that most people don't realize is that there's no long-term evidence that these drugs work. Most people don't realize this, but antidepressants are usually studied for 8 to 12 weeks, rarely longer, and never beyond a year. And this is a huge disconnect if you consider that the average real-world use, like the median use of these drugs in people who take them, it's 5 years. That's a long time. And thank God this is finally being acknowledged, because the FDA's own Chief Scientific Officer, Vinay Prasad, recently said in a published article last year this: there is a huge mismatch between short-term trials and long-term use, and we simply do not have good evidence supporting this kind of prescribing. And so if we don't know really what's happening long-term, I have to tell you some of the troubling things that I see. And I see 2 troubling things often happen with these medications. The first is the issue of tolerance. These drugs slowly stop working over time. You'll have someone come in, they get on the medication, 6 months later, they come back, they need the dose to be higher. Within 2 years, they're maxed out on the dose and there's nowhere to go apart from adding a new medication or essentially settling there where you're stuck on a drug that really isn't doing anything. And now the second issue is drug-induced worsening, sometimes called tardive dysphoria. Now here's how I understand this. This is essentially drug-induced worsening over time. And I think that the human brain simply is not designed to be in a chronically drugged state for years or sometimes decades. And particularly with the antidepressants like the SSRIs, what I start to notice in some patients who are on them long term is they start to have a lot of fatigue and cognitive fog. And so they just feel tired all the time and they can't concentrate. Unfortunately, this is often misdiagnosed as the illness getting worse, when in reality, it's actually a delayed side effect to the drug, which is now, which was there to help them with depression, but it's now actually making them sicker. Now, the third issue with these medications has to do with brain development. And this is the part that every parent should pause on, because we now have over a dozen MRI studies that shows that early SSRI exposure during pregnancy is associated with measurable brain differences in the brains of kids who were born exposed to the drugs versus those who are not. And what researchers have found when they followed these kids up long-term into adolescence is that these brain changes persisted, and they found altered signaling in the amygdala, which is an area of the brain that controls things like anxiety. Now, that relates to just kids who are exposed in utero. What about when you give them to young kids? Well, unfortunately, we can't do that study because it would be unethical to randomize a group of kids to a drug and a group of kids to placebo and then just see what happens over time. But we have done this with monkeys. And when we've taken juvenile monkeys and exposed them to Prozac for a long period of time, we see all sorts of changes in the brain. We see that they have altered serotonin system receptors, and they also have changes in the dendritic spines. This is a complicated way of saying these drugs change the brain. And what is more concerning is that with these juvenile monkeys, when they removed the drugs and then looked at their brains several years later, they found that these changes didn't reverse. And so the takeaway for this is simple. It's no small thing to put a young developing brain on a drug that can alter the developmental trajectory of the brain. Now, the fourth issue with these drugs has to do with the chemical imbalance myth. I'm going to say it clearly now. Depression and anxiety are not caused by low serotonin. And antidepressants that lift serotonin levels, they're not fixing anything. The way these drugs work is by inducing a drug effect, most commonly emotional numbing or blunting. And sometimes that blunting can feel stabilizing. It can even feel life-saving in a crisis. I mean, who wouldn't feel better if you're being bombarded with anxiety and you take something that suppresses that? You will experience that as being therapeutic. But framing these drugs as biological correction is misleading, because if a child is depressed or anxious, there's almost always a reason. Is it stress at home because a parent's having problems with alcoholism, or they have their own mental illness, or they're getting bullied at school? Is it trauma? Is there loneliness going on? Is there sleep deprivation? Are they eating a diet filled with ultra-processed food and not moving their body, or are they using substances like cannabis? If you simply ignore the multitude of things that can make kids unhappy and mask it with a drug, you are not treating the root causes, and those issues will fester in the background and they will get worse over time. Now, the final issue with these medications is that they can lead to a prescribing cascade. Now, what is that? Well, a prescribing cascade is when you get on a drug and then you have a side effect to it. And so what that could look like with an antidepressant is you get on this medication and then all of a sudden you become more irritable, on edge, or angry. And then a doctor looks at that and says, well, maybe you're developing bipolar disorder. And then they don't get rid of the antidepressant and they stack another drug on top of that. And then the next thing that happens, because you're on the drug for bipolar disorder, you start to have concentration issues. And then they say, oh, maybe he has ADHD. And then another drug comes on top of that. And so if a doctor isn't paying attention to this, this can be one of the most common pathways that something benign, like some anxiety caused by like a breakup or something like that, all of a sudden it morphs into this condition where you're taking 3 different drugs and you have, bipolar disorder. So now that you know the 5 major risks associated with these medications, what should you do if your child is anxious or depressed? Now, the first thing for parents to understand is that they have to be humble. A lot of the things that can make kids unhappy can actually be problems inside the home. Are you having your own mental health problems, or is there some problems with the siblings? You need to recognize that the home environment may sometimes be stressful. And that's why it's so important when you're helping kids with anxiety and depression that it's done as a family. It is always better for you to do therapy with your child if they're anxious and depressed and you think something might be happening at home. Now, the next thing that you should address is their physiology. This is diet and exercise. Help them get outside. Kids need movement, sunlight, and regular physical activity. And they also need nutrient-dense real food. Unfortunately, in the US, children get about 60% of their calories from ultra-processed foods. These foods are high in sugar and chemically laden and are inflammatory, and they are strongly linked to depression, anxiety, and brain fog. And the last thing that I want to say to parents is that if your kid is unhappy, but more or less they're still doing okay, is that you can give it some time. Before the 1990s, it was widely accepted that kids would go through periods of anxiety, sadness, and all of that. This is simply part of growing up. Kids go through relationship problems and bullying and all sorts of things in their lives. And you grew through that. That was normal. But since the 1990s, we've become so obsessed with mental health. Parents and teachers have been flooded with mental health messaging that is actually making them think that if your kid is unhappy somehow, that this is not your domain and you can't help them and it could be something serious and it needs professional intervention. Unfortunately, this often ends up being, take your kid to the doctor and then the doctor has 15 minutes, so they put them on a medication. And so what I want to remind you is that if the situation isn't dangerous or severe, just take a breath. Don't panic. Support your child, let them know that you love them, and stay present with them, and they'll probably grow out of it. Now, the next group of drugs to be aware of are the second most commonly prescribed drugs in kids, and these are ADHD medications. These are drugs like Adderall, Ritalin, and Vyvanse, and currently around 5 to 6% of kids in the US are taking them. This is roughly 1 to 2 kids per classroom. Now, there are several issues with ADHD medications, and we're going to start here with the first one, and that is that ADHD is not a dopamine deficiency. These drugs are not correcting a chemical imbalance. They are inducing a temporary drug effect. And this matters a lot because when people believe that a drug is fixing something like insulin for diabetes, they stop asking the hard questions about where these symptoms are coming from. Because ADHD symptoms, just like the problems with depression, they can be caused by stress at home, poor sleep, ultra-processed foods, lack of movement, trauma, and really, sometimes just normal immaturity in younger boys. When researchers look at the association between the age of the kid in the classroom and their likelihood of getting prescribed ADHD medications, there's like a 40% boost if you are on the younger side of that classroom. And so what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that we are simply medicating immaturity. If a kid is up and they're having a hard time paying attention, and there may be nothing wrong with that kid, apart from him being slightly younger than his peers. Now, unfortunately, a lot of teachers, they're not going to like that, and they can put pressure on parents to get that child medicated. Now, the second issue to be aware of is that these drugs do not improve academic performance. A lot of parents out there think stimulants help their kids learn better and they can have a competitive edge and they'll get a better career and all of that. The data simply does not support that. Multiple studies now show that taking stimulants does not lead to improved cognitive performance or academic marks. But there's something really interesting here because these drugs do something. When researchers have looked at this, what they find is that the kids who take stimulants actually feel better about the work that they complete than the kids who don't. And so the effect that this is having is not that it's improving grades, it's that these drugs make kids feel more confident about the work that they're doing. And so this is really like an emotional and a mood effect rather than actually increasing their performance. And that is not the same as becoming smarter. Now, the third issue is that the benefits of these drugs fade. Now, one of the most effective things that stimulants can do is that they can control behavior. So if you have a very hyperactive kid, maybe they're a little bit aggressive and they're not listening to the teacher and they're getting out of their seat a lot, parents, they're often pushed to medicate this kid by the teachers, and then they go and get the script from the doctor and they give it to the kid, and the kid's behavior changes almost overnight. This can be really dramatic. So the kid ends up sitting still and they're super locked in on their work, and everyone breathes a big sigh of relief. But the unfortunate thing is that the largest long-term follow-up study ever done to look at the effects of Ritalin over time showed that these behavioral effects faded by about 3 years. That means the kids are adapting to the effect of the drug and it's wearing off. And this kind of begs the question, if you lose the effect of the drug after 3 years, why even take it to begin with if it's not a long-term solution? Now, the fourth issue has to do with the side effects of the medications. Stimulants reliably worsen sleep quality and they suppress appetite. And this isn't just a little bit of appetite suppression, because when researchers have looked at kids who take these medications long-term, they find that they are 1 inch shorter on average than the kids who do not take stimulants. And so this is a lack of appetite that is leading to nutritional deficits that are impacting their height. And the last thing that these drugs can do is they can cause anxiety, irritability, and sometimes issues like mania or psychosis. These are all labeled drug side effects. And again, just like with the antidepressants, if these things are missed, you end up on a drug cascade where, you get on an ADHD med and all of a sudden you're anxious, and then they put you on an SSRI, and then you become very irritable and hostile, and then they put you on a bipolar medication. This is a pattern that I see constantly. And so to wrap things up on the ADHD meds, if you're a parent and your kid's having some of these issues, here's what I do first. Firstly, if you're doing this for the grades, don't. Having good grades is not the same as success in life. Usually the people who do the best long term are successful because they find something they're naturally drawn to and go deep into it. One of the worst things that can happen is to end up in a career or doing some kind of work where you can only keep up with it if you're on medications. Some of the saddest stories I've seen are people who got on stimulants when they were younger because they thought they needed to be on that to do well in finance, and then the side effects catch up with them and they want to come off, and when they do come off, they find that they're not actually interested in their job and they were only able to do it because they were on stimulant medications. Don't go down that path. Help your kid find something that they're naturally interested in that they can do without medication. Now, if your kid is having problems with hyperactivity or maybe aggression, there are some essential things to do before relying on medications. The first thing is to fix their diet, is to help them with their sleep, get your kid moving daily, and also if you're having a lot of frustration controlling their behavior, you can do parent-child behavioral therapy, and it's only after trying all of those things that I would consider putting a child on a stimulant. We're now going to move on to the last section and talk about a class of drugs which I think are the most dangerous out of these three, and these are the antipsychotics. And so antipsychotics include drugs like Abilify, Seroquel, and Zyprexa. Now, these drugs were initially designed and put onto the market to help patients with schizophrenia, but they're now commonly prescribed for kids who are having behavioral issues, sleep issues, or even medication side effects. And so let's jump in. So the number one issue with antipsychotics in kids is that these drugs are typically used, in my experience, to treat the side effects of other drugs. That's right. Many kids placed on antipsychotics haven't developed schizophrenia or juvenile bipolar disorder or anything else. They are actually reacting to side effects from antidepressants or stimulants. Now, why does this happen? Why would doctors not pick this up? Well, it happens because of two reasons. The first reason is a lot of doctors don't have the training to pick up these side effects. And the second reason is even more depressing. It's that this takes a lot of time to do. It takes a lot of time to do the history to identify these side effects. And so when these doctors are in a time crunch, usually they say, okay, worsening hostility, elevated mood, it must be bipolar disorder. And then they think just putting them on a medication is the better safe than sorry route when it's actually making the kid worse in the long run. Now, the second frightening issue that parents are nearly never told is that taking antipsychotics is associated with brain volume loss. Now, when researchers have looked at monkeys to see the effects of antipsychotics on their brains, what they find is this. If you take a group of monkeys and you give them antipsychotics and you compare them to a group that is not exposed, the exposed group ends up with an 8 to 11% reduction in brain volume loss in the frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is one of the most important parts of the brain that is associated with your emotional stability, but also with your reasoning skills. And when researchers have also followed this up in human studies looking at patients with schizophrenia, they see the exact same effect. They find that the duration that you're on a drug is strongly correlated with how much brain shrinkage has occurred. And so if this is happening in adults, just imagine the risk in children who are usually more sensitive to side effects. Now, the third issue has been recognized by the medical community for decades, but it's nearly never told to parents. And that is that these drugs can cause something called tardive dyskinesia. This is a side effect that leads to involuntary facial and mouth movements. And the worst part of this is that it can potentially be permanent. That's right. Even when you come off the drug, kids who develop this side effect may have it for the rest of their life. And this isn't overly rare either. When researchers have looked at how frequent this is, they find that every year you're on the medication, 5% of the patients will go on to develop tardive dyskinesia. And one of the biggest misconceptions about this side effect is that many people believe that this can't happen if you take it for a short period of time or low doses. However, in the drug labels themselves, it says clearly there that they see tardive dyskinesia even at low doses and when the drug is used for a short period of time. Now, the next issue to be aware of are the metabolic side effects of this drug, and there's two that you should be worried about. The first one is diabetes. These drugs cause blood sugar dysregulation, which can put kids at a higher chance of developing type 2 diabetes. As for weight gain, the weight gain with these medications can be a lot. It is very common to gain 10, 20, 30 pounds on these medications, but personally, in my experience, I've seen people gain 50 to 100 pounds on antipsychotic medications. This is to the point where I've had some patients, who gained so much weight that all of a sudden they had loose skin around their arms, and when they got off the medications, they needed to get surgery to remove the loose skin. And so this can also be very disfiguring if it gets out of hand. And the final issue to be aware of with these antipsychotic medications is that they can cause a condition called akathisia. Now, akathisia is one of the worst side effects you could ever get. And the way people describe it feeling is like this. They say it is an intense state of internal restlessness, which makes them want to move constantly. They feel very tense and very on edge. And what we've noticed in the medical community going back decades now is that akathisia frequently preempts suicide or even aggression. And so this state of being can make people lash out in ways that are very uncharacteristic. And while this is just speculation, this could potentially be the side effect that contributed to Nick Reiner murdering his parents recently. And that there have been a lot of reports that he was having problems with his psychiatric medications before the murders. Now, Nick was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. This means it was very likely he was getting antipsychotic medications. And when the police looked at what had happened on the night of the murders, they noticed a few strange things. The first thing is that he walked from Brentwood, where the murder was, to a hotel. And this was like 3 hours away. Now, this kind of pacing and this movement and this need to walk is really common if you have akathisia. On top of that, we also have video surveillance of him being in a convenience store, and you can see him kind of hopping from one leg to another. Now, to the untrained eye, this can just look like a nervous person or someone that's restless. But when we get this greater history that he was having problems with medication and he was walking all over town, I can't help but think, could the murders have possibly been related to this side effect? And so parents, what should you do before agreeing to put your kid on an antipsychotic? The first thing, and I'm going to double underline this, is think, could this be a side effect to another drug? Now, psychiatric drugs are usually the most common, but you need to also look at things like the oral contraceptive pill, sometimes asthma drugs like Montelukast or Singulair, and sometimes even things like cannabis. And the final thing to be aware of before you use antipsychotic medications is that dietary interventions can be very powerful for kids who are having symptoms of psychosis. And there are two major things you should try. These have evidence behind them. The first one is a gluten-free diet. I know that sounds like a fad. It is not. Anyone who's having symptoms of psychosis should try a gluten-free diet. And the second thing is a ketogenic diet. There is a growing body of evidence out there showing that ketogenic style diets can be powerful enough to get to the point where people who have had psychosis in the past, they no longer need to be on psychiatric medication. So you want to try those two things. And so to wrap this video up, I want to be clear. My message is not to never use medications. My message is that this is a serious decision. There are side effects that go along with it. There is potentially effects on the development of your child's brain. So make sure that you do all of the non-drug approaches first. If you found this video interesting, you might like this next one. Recently, I analyzed a news story about a terrifying incident where a young girl stabbed her younger brother to death shortly after being prescribed a medication.